Arguably, the most important part of the production process is planning what you want to do, why you want to do it, what you want it to sound like, all these kinds of things. This is especially important if you are in a band with other people, because oftentimes you'll have 4 or 5 people that all have a different opinion of where the album should end up. And without a plan, they just start writing things and it just kind of goes wherever it goes. And then towards the end is when it starts to take shape and people are like, hey, this isn't sounding the way that I had it in mind. And then someone else will be like, oh, this is exactly what I had in mind. And then things aren't really lining up so well. So it's super beneficial to lay all of your plans out ahead of time. If you're like me and it's just like a solo project, you don't really need to do this. But I have found that if I don't have a plan, usually the result just kind of ends up kind of wherever. You know what I mean? It's not really cohesive at all. So this is why I like to plan the fuck out of everything. I had kind of a nickname in my former bands back in the day. They used to call me Pre-Pro Greg, which basically just meant like, oh shit, he's getting all serious and organized and stuff. And I like to have a plan. So here we go. I feel like this is kind of like the fun stage where you let your imagination run wild and you get to come up with all kinds of ideas for the project. And, kind of like being a kid again, it's like, if this project could do anything for you, what would it do? Are you trying to reach new fans with this? Are you just trying to basically do the same thing that you've always done? Are you trying to do like a new sound? Do you have new members that, you're excited to work with? You want to try to hone your focus and be as specific as possible in this planning phase, because this plan that you set forth now is going to guide you through the rest of the process and will actually make things easier. So like when it comes to planning and goals, some of the questions we want to ask are, what are the goals of the project? What would you like for it to say? How do you want it to feel? How do you want it to sound? What do you want it to represent? Like, do you have certain ideas, or are you like into politics or something and you want to put that into your music because there's like not enough politics everywhere right now already? Maybe. I think you'd be crazy to think that, but anyway. I will show you kind of how I approach planning and how I'm looking at this project. So certain things I like to think about when it comes to making a project like this is the purpose. Why am I fucking making this album? I might blur this out because this is my own purpose. You'll have your own purpose for your album. And when your album's done, you can probably be a little bit more forthcoming. But in the infancy of the project, it might be better just to kind of keep this stuff to yourself so that you can kind of develop the ideas a little bit more. I feel like once you kind of put stuff out into the world, it kind of makes it a little bit harder to work on because then people start to expect things. So that's why I might be blurring some of this out. It's going to be primarily an album, but I also want to work on the visuals at the same time. So I have plans for the visuals as well as the audio. This is my task list for different things that I want to accomplish during the production process. Most of the actual audio stuff is all right up in here. Finalized audio recording. So that's fairly early in the process. And then the rest of this has to do with promotion and creating different promo materials and stuff. I want to create the visuals at the same time that I'm making the music for this because I want them to kind of feed each other and be part of the same whole, if any of that makes sense. So that was part of my plan with this. I made a Spotify playlist that is just full of inspiration that is actually for this project. I might blur this out too because, and then I also have kind of like a little idea board for visual things because I will be working on visuals. And I've got this part from the movie The Ring because I thought this was pretty cool. So yeah, I just have different visual inspiration. This Norbert Crowfield dude is badass. I can't do stuff like that, but I'd like to. Maybe someday. So visual things, that helps me write music a lot. And then there's just regular visual, like still image. And this is just stuff to kind of get me in the creative mode to match the aesthetic. Basically, I want the album to sound like how these images look, if that makes sense. It probably doesn't. Maybe it does. I don't know. I have an idea to make the entire album kind of like a concept thing. I'll probably blur that out too, because, it's probably going to change a bunch. Leviathan, that's the working title so far. I don't know if that's even going to end up being part of the title in the end, but for now, that's what I'm fucking calling it. This is the aesthetic that I would like to aim for. I want to have a lot of rhythmic vocals just because I feel like that's fun. Really percussive guitars. I'm not going to go through every detail. I want it to be pretty moody without being too much of a downer. I don't want to make a downer album, but I want it to be like heavy emotionally. Vocally diverse. I really like dark, like drum and bass electronic music, and I've yet to work that into any of my own stuff. So that is a goal that I have with this project. It may or may not work out. We'll see what happens. Ideas for sounds that I want, like how I want certain things to sound, like what types of vocals, bass tones, guitar tones, drum sounds, what types of tempos. I want to experiment a lot with tempo changes and like kind of warping tempos. Some bands, it's not like it'd be like I'd be the first one to do it, but it'd be new for me. And I feel like I'd be able to do that in some interesting ways that I haven't personally heard before, but you know, everything's basically been done. I'm just going to try to carve out my own kind of unique way of doing certain things and hoping that it turns out cool. Scales and keys, if you have a certain key that you want to stick to, or like a vocal range. If your vocalist sings best in a certain range, you should probably figure that out now before you start writing a shit ton of material. I like industrial music, so I want to include some of that. This is going to probably, I'm hoping that this ends up with a lot more electronic influence than my previous stuff, just because I want to. And that stuff resonates with me, so I'm going to try to inject some more of that. So here's me saying that for the record, so it's not like, oh, what happened? It's like, dude, it was on purpose. I want to have a bunch of different types of guitar tones and textures rather than just, you know, rhythm guitar and then throwing some shit on top of that. I want to use soundscapes and ambience. I want to have transition songs, so I'm aiming for 10 singles, but when the album comes out, I'd like all of those to be connected by some like little ambient transitional pieces. Excluding certain things, I don't want what I call going to the window style vocals. That's kind of a trendy thing. It used to be more of an emo thing that I used to not like, but I hear it more often now manifested in like where it sounds like the singer just kind of runs out of gas, but they left it in anyway. Obviously that's on purpose because it's fucking all over the place now, but I just personally, I don't like how it sounds, so I'm going to exclude that shit. If I try something and it works, then maybe I'll fucking end up using it. But as of now, my plan is to not include that anywhere at all at any point in the fucking record. I also don't want any rapping. I am fond of like a rapping style delivery, but I don't want it to come across like where I'm basically just speaking it. If I do anything that sounds like rapping, it's probably going to be just like the cadence and the rhythm. I still want it to sound like metal vocals. I'm going to try to avoid cliches when possible, but hey, if something works, fuck it. I want to try to avoid things that are obvious and expected, but sometimes that's really fucking cool. So that's why I have, you know, unless the song calls for it. So this is kind of a formula. If, you know, I kind of get hung up at any point in the process, I can come back to this and be, oh yeah, this is basically what I am aiming for, and this is how to do it. Kind of like a recipe, I guess. Lyrical sparks, just ideas. As they pop into my head, I'm just putting lyrical ideas here that I can expand into songs later. This is where I first brainstormed my rollout plan. This was the simple version, which later became this thing that I ended up making a schedule for. The schedule is kind of tentative for now, but I feel like it's super important to put a date on things. That way, if you don't have a fucking date on it, it's just going to fucking take like 3 years to fucking do it. Or maybe it'll just never get done. Discovery questions. These are questions that I like to ask artists that I am working with, just so I can kind of get more on the same page with them. You know what? I'll probably just make a link to this or something, and then you can answer these questions yourself. Basically, by answering these questions on this questionnaire, it kind of gives your album a shape before you start, and then you can use this to design your production plan. I will post a link to this in the description. What is this album's message? You might not have any lyrics or any themes in mind yet, but this is important to think about, because if you have a message for your project, it gives your audience something to get behind, and they can get behind it without even hearing the first bit of music, really. So if you do have a message, it's important to try to put that into your album. If you don't have one yet, be thinking about one. Who is this album for? You should be making music for yourself first, because if the music doesn't excite you, then it's probably not going to excite anybody. But at the same time, it's very beneficial to have some sort of audience in mind when you're writing. Like, always be writing for somebody, even if you make that person up, or even if it's like a younger version of yourself. Try to have some sort of intent and don't just randomly throw shit together. That's basically it. So those are my plans for this album. And yeah, just try to think of that type of shit shit, because in my opinion, this is all stuff that goes into a successful album. And you can either think about it ahead of time or wait till it's too late to think about it, or try to scramble and just try to stay on top of it as you need to. But for me, I would rather just kind of lay out a plan, even if it's just tentative. Like, all of this stuff can change, but this at least gives me something to follow, so I don't have to think about it all the time. I can just look at this fucking list and be like, oh, what's the date? Oh, I need to be working on this. I don't need to be working on all of this other shit because that's not till fucking next year or whatever. That's it. So far we've been collecting riff ideas, or sparks, whatever you want to call them, and we have laid out plans and goals for the project. In the next one, I am going to go over my songwriting template because that's important to have. So I'll see you on the next one. Later!